Hello, everybody. So today I want to talk about MicroStrategy, not about the performance. We know the stock is doing outstanding right now. There's not much to say about that. Long-term hold for me, the stock is doing great. I want to talk about MicroStrategy as a Bitcoin development company, and I want to specifically address some of the chatter on Twitter and YouTube about Bitcoin yield and what that means. You may remember my last video was already about that briefly. MicroStrategy, what is their mission as a company, their new mission, right? They moved away from being just that software business few people knew about before 2020. What is their new mission? Well, their new mission is to increase the Bitcoin bag, the Bitcoin treasury. They want to increase it. Why? Because Bitcoin is scarce. They will never be ever more than 21 million. And by increasing the Bitcoin bag, you're increasing your performance over just pure Bitcoin that you would have in a brain wallet. You know, you just remember your private keys. You would increase that performance, right? And you would have a much greater performance because you're buying an asset that acquires more Bitcoin for you. And of course, much of the return of the Bitcoin has to do with the fact that the Bitcoin grows on its own. There's more Bitcoin in MicroStrategy for what they do, but especially because of the money debasement. Bitcoin is a money debasement story. The dollar, they can't stop printing it. They will keep printing it to infinity. Over 100 years, 99% of the currency's value will be gone. That's Charlie Munger, a hater of Bitcoin, saying that. You just buy Bitcoin, you wait for the value of the USD to sink. And of course, if you buy MicroStrategy, you buy an operating company, a Bitcoin development company, a company that will be accretive in terms of new Bitcoin, that will earn a Bitcoin yield, that will grow its Bitcoin bag. That is the whole rationale why owning MicroStrategy, in my view, makes sense. They just acquire more Bitcoin for you through their various activities, hence where the Bitcoin yield comes in. So how do you grow the Bitcoin bag? Well, the original idea of 2020, we've discussed this many times before on the channel, is synthetic mining. You're acting as a synthetic miner, i.e. you run a totally unrelated business on the side. That's their original legacy software business, their business intelligence company, and the cash flows from that business, you just buy Bitcoin with it. That's the original idea. Today, of course, MicroStrategy has grown up, and today's idea is that they are actively shorting the US dollar. And how do they do that? Well, they dilute the shareholders of the company less quickly than they increase the Bitcoin. And that's the original idea of the Bitcoin yield. And you may remember my video about this, about their latest SEC form, where they explain this strategy in great detail. You can see over the past 9 months, they grew the Bitcoin pie, the Bitcoin bag, by 29%. And they only grew that by 29% through a dilution of the shares of only 10.6%. And even better than that, the dilution in those shares happens at those dates, right? So that's assumed diluted shares outstanding down the road in the future. That dilution is happening in the future. It's not even happening today. So anyways, let's assume it happened today. You dilute, let's call it 11%, but you grow the bag by 29%. This is accretive dilution. This is powerful dilution. This is shorting the currency, and they're doing that pretty well. Now, on this channel, I've explored other ways that they could grow the Bitcoin bag, and they inevitably will, in my view. One of the ways would be to write options, and then you would collect the premium on those options, and with that premium you buy BTC. Another way, of course, would be to wrap the BTC on various layer ones, other layer ones, right? You can wrap BTC on Solana, you can wrap BTC on Ethereum. When you do that, you allow people on the Solana network to just own Bitcoin on that network. This is, classic crypto. Of course, this is not as good as pure BTC, but this is still better than lending your BTC to an analog company, which we'll talk about in a second, which is what the controversy is about. But you still have greater control over it, albeit less, because you're not owning it directly on the network. You could also do this on a Bitcoin layer 2, right? That's the Lightning network for you. That's a Bitcoin layer 2. If you put your Bitcoin on the BTC Lightning network, what you do is you earn fees. with those fees that you either earn on other blockchains, or that you earn on a layer 2 on Bitcoin, with those fees, what you do, you buy BTC. That would be another way to increase the bag. Then they could quite simply, and they've done that before, but you could quite simply pledge your Bitcoin as collateral to a Bitcoin lender and borrow more Bitcoin against your Bitcoin. That's very straightforward. They've done that before. You could also, and MicroStrategy, with MicroStrategy Orange, I started doing that. You could also monetize individual sats for different purposes, and that would be Web3 purposes. So you could like take some sats of your bag and do it into ordinals, or do it into identity checks in different places. MicroStrategy has talked about that before. Saylor has talked about that before, and he's devoting a little bit of the company's engineers to that idea. These are just ideas that they're exploring, and there's more ideas than what we can see right now on how you could earn yield. But what I want to discuss today is the idea of the pure yield, i.e. lending the Bitcoin to some company, some household, some country, lending the Bitcoin and then earning the yield. That's the controversy I want to discuss today. And let's go and talk about it. So, how much Bitcoin do they have? Well, they have 252,000 Bitcoin, right? More than 1% of the total supply. Let's assume they earned a 5% yield. That would give you, a price to the BTC, a P2 BTC value, if you want, of a 20 with a 5% yield, and you'd be earning $829 million of Bitcoin right now on that $16.5 billion bag if you landed it at 5%. So, of course, that's somewhat compelling, but a lot of Bitcoin lovers, Bitcoin maximalists are saying that's not worth the risk. And this is what I want to address here, is that I kind of agree it's not worth the risk, because we assume they will be lending the Bitcoin at 5%. And I think that is a wrong assumption. There is no way, in my view, someone like MicroStrategy, some company like MicroStrategy would lend the Bitcoin at 5%. They would lend it for much higher than that. 5% to borrow the strongest asset on earth that can't be diluted? Who are we kidding? The Bitcoin would be lent at much higher percentage points, in my view. Bitcoin is not fiat. It's not something that a commercial bank can just write on a ledger and create out of thin air, right? The interest rates that we've been used to a primary extent since the Fed for very low rates, and to a secondary extent since the Medici family and the invention of fractional reverse banking, and that was for the past 500 years, these rates are not the real rates of money. They're not the natural rates of money under a hard money standard. Under a hard money standard, the natural rates of money are much higher than that. We need to go back to the gold standard to know what the real rate of Bitcoin would be close to. And by the way, Bitcoin would likely have a rate that's 2 to 3% higher than anything you would get in the gold standard, because the gold supply increases by 2 to 3% a year, not Bitcoin. Bitcoin supply does not increase every year. So that's point number one, but it would be roughly the same, right? Let's use gold standard interest rates as a proxy for Bitcoin, but we also need to use full reserve banking era. We can't compare the rates that we even had in the 1700s and the 1800s. We can't use those rates. We have to go back to medieval times before the invention of fractional reserve banking to actually get an idea of what the rates on Bitcoin would be on a hard money, full reserve banking era. If we went back to this era, what would those rates be? Well, I asked ChatGPT-4 about it, so I asked, how high were the interest rates on money in the Middle Age before the invention of fractional reserve banking by the Medicis? And let's ask ChatGPT, and what do we know? Well, the interest rates in the Middle Age, medieval loans, they would be, if you were, a trader or a monarch or someone like that, someone high up, they would be in the early days between 20 and 50%, right? And the commoner did not have access to loans. Today anybody has access to loans. Back then it was monarchs, right? It was people engaged in trade who had access to loans, because you needed to justify that ROI. Most people didn't borrow money, and the people who borrowed money, they borrowed it at a much higher rate, right? 20 to 50%. If you had to buy a ship to go explore somewhere, it was a very risky time. And if you go to the late Middle Ages, so when banking families started becoming a thing, but we still had full reserve and we still had gold reserve, it was 10 to 20%. So what is the natural interest rate in a full reserve banking system and in a hard money banking system? Well, it's at, in my view, it's at the very least 15%, which is the debasement of the USD. It depends on what you look at, right? But it wouldn't be far-fetched to imagine that the rate would be 25%. It would absolutely not be far-fetched, or even higher than that, because you're going to be giving up your private keys. You're going to be giving up your private keys here. Like we're not talking about fiat. So under a full reserve standard, the rates, first of all, most people would not borrow money, and you would only borrow money for like the insanely obvious investments. And I think investments would have to be 25, probably 50% return on investment is probably the threshold where you could justify borrowing money. A lot of the misallocation of capital that we see in today's modern day society, like, I don't know, randomly people building bank and branches everywhere. Well, we don't need those anymore. I could go on and on and on. Pharmacy chains building new pharmacies in the physical world, right? New retail locations opening. Anyways, doesn't matter. All of this malinvestment that you see would entirely go away under a Bitcoin standard. It would only be the highest reward investments that would get financed. When money is not solely scriptural or inputted into a ledger by a bank, and when it's hard money, the money is going to be leaving your coffers and may not return. You're giving up your private keys. If we're talking in Bitcoin stands, you would be giving up your private keys. To give up your private keys, you bet, depending on the project, MicroStrategy would charge 25 to 50%. They would not charge 5%. And I think that's where a lot of the misconception comes from. So could MicroStrategy become a full reserve Bitcoin bank of sort, or full reserve banks? Well, that is, they would lend Bitcoin, give up the private keys, i.e. ship the Bitcoin, ship the gold, lose access to it. Well, let's go through multiple scenarios. A scenario which I believe would never happen under a Bitcoin standard would be frankly, the typical example around the world of newlyweds. They want to buy their house and they want a 3% down mortgage to buy that house. There is no way this would happen under a Bitcoin standard. This is way too risky. Only full reserve would work here. Only you would need to save the money. And maybe if you save the money, you could borrow against that money that you've saved. Only full reserve banking loans would happen. This is just too much risk. Too much risk. What if the real estate goes down? What if someone decides to spend money on something? This is just too much risk. And that's why I've always said mortgages are sponsored by the government. A 3% mortgages is an artifact of a banking system. It is a gift. It is a gift. It is not the true cost of money. In my view, most of the borrowing as we know today under a Bitcoin standard would disappear. A form of borrowing that would still exist in my view, but that would be more rare would be an example, say Apple Computer, right? The biggest company in the world wants to borrow Bitcoin, right? So if that were to happen, I think this could happen, provided that the company, is trusted and has cash flows to pay high interest. These type of loans would happen, but they would be at a high interest. Now, moving on to Bitcoin loans, that could happen, I think, at a more medium interest rate, let's say 20-25%. That would be an example of lending Bitcoin to a too big to fail bank. And this is where I think the proper lending agreement is. This is where I think Bitcoin would perhaps carry the least risk. And so imagine MicroStrategy were to lend Bitcoin to, say, a JP Morgan, for example. Well, what if JP Morgan could not pay off the Bitcoin, right? JP Morgan would face bankruptcy. The loans wouldn't be paid, except would a financially important financial institution like JP Morgan ever face bankruptcy? No, because they're considered too big to fail. These systematically important banks will be bailed out. They will be bailed out. It is a known fact that they will be bailed out because they are too big to fail. They're financially important financial institutions. So if you were to lend Bitcoin to one of these entities, you would get repaid your interest. You get your interest paid, and if you didn't get the Bitcoin back, because I don't know, they lost it or whatever, then you would likely write into the contract, well, you gotta refund me in fiat, and I'm gonna use the fiat to rebuy the Bitcoin. And that's just forcing the bank to activate the government printer. And the same analogy without the layer of the bank would happen to the US government, right? Without the layer of the bank. But these two institutions are very much related. So scenario 3 and scenario 4, you could imagine lending the Bitcoin there, but if you lend the Bitcoin, in my view, you still would not lend it at 5%. You would lend it maybe at 12, maybe at 15%, not at 5%. Why? And this was the crux of the controversy. Why? Because you're giving up your private keys. So whenever you give up your private keys, you are exposing yourself to an Executive Order 6102 type risk, which is when the government in the 30s confiscated the gold that was held at banks. They confiscated the golds, and so they could confiscate the Bitcoin. And in that case, if you've lent your Bitcoin, well, you're not protected. You're not getting the Bitcoin back because the Bitcoin was confiscated. The Bitcoin, in that case, would only be confiscated, though not because of Bitcoin, but because you agreed to take on the risk to transfer your private keys. You transferred your private keys. And against that scenario, only private keys can protect you, which, by the way, is the major innovation of Bitcoin compared to gold. Gold can be taken by force, right? Bitcoin, it's a much tougher story, right? This is the whole theory of Bitcoin. Bitcoin theoretically could be taken by force in the form of electricity, in the form of enough electricity to break the network. But in order to break the network, you got to secure the hardware. So first you need a lot of energy to buy all of the hardware. And then you need to buy the hardware in a matter of a few days, of course, because the difficulty of the network increases exponentially. And then you need to channel enough energy into that hardware in order to be able to thermodynamically break the code. This is why mining is so important to Bitcoin. There is the amount of power that it would take to do a 50% attack is inconceivable. It's inconceivable. Power in both actually getting your hands on the rigs, on enough rigs, and both also getting the power to power those rigs having enough power. So it's thermodynamically sound. It's one of the early videos I had about Bitcoin. It's the protection of a million armies afforded to the common man, is the idea of Bitcoin. You have a million armies protecting your gold, right? Gold, you didn't have that. And all you would do if they did that, of course, is that Bitcoin would likely fork and cancel your access and your transaction anyway. So only private keys protect you against that, right? So that's the main risk to keep in mind. But as long as we don't have that issue, lending to a financially important institution, one that knows it's going to get bailed out if there were to be a problem, I think the risk is way lower. This is a no-go, and that's what happens, I think, when people criticize MicroStrategy. This is a no-go, right? They're not going to be financing car buying or house buying with a Bitcoin. No, that's a no-go. This is a maybe, but this is higher risk. And so this is all I wanted to say about the Bitcoin yield. I personally wouldn't have a problem if MicroStrategy lent Bitcoin in scenario 3 or in scenario 4. In scenario 2, the interest would need to be really high, and in scenario 1, I would have a major problem with that. So that was the controversy explained. Hopefully that makes some sense. In the meantime, MicroStrategy has not engaged in this yet. For now, they are just accumulating Bitcoin. That is what they're doing for now. So this was not investment advice. This is no financial advice, just entertainment. Please like, please subscribe. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day.